Her father handed her an eviction notice at a wedding, but he never expected the mafia boss to read it aloud. Harper thought the cake theft was the worst humiliation of the night, until Preston Quinn pulled her into the library and reminded her she owned nothing. Not even her home. He called her useful. Not talented. Invisible. Not important. But when Roman Calder found her outside in the cold, that piece of paper became more dangerous than any weapon in the room. Look at them, the rich. Polished guests laughing at the quiet baker at her own sister's wedding. They have no idea the most feared man in Boston is about to walk through those doors. Before this night ends, Harper Quinn will be humiliated in front of 200 people, robbed of the masterpiece she built, and handed an eviction notice by her own father. For now, she stands alone beside a breathtaking cake she spent 61 sleepless hours creating, while her sister tells everyone it was flown in from Paris. Outside, the ocean crashes against the cliffs. Inside, Harper's silence is about to become the one thing her family cannot control. It began in a cheap rented kitchen in Providence at 3:17 in the morning. Flour dusted the cold floor while Harper's hands shook from exhaustion. Outside, the damp streets were asleep. Inside, an old refrigerator hummed like it was fighting to stay alive. Harper stared at 6 tiers of almond sponge, brushed with champagne syrup and wrapped in ivory buttercream. Every sugar peony had been shaped petal by petal, then threaded with gold vines that looked like sunlight caught in lace. She had poured 61 hours into this cake, giving up sleep and what little money she had for a sister who had never once asked what it cost her. She had done everything Vanessa asked, and now the ordeal was almost over. Harper stepped back, spine stiff, apron dusted white. Her cramped fingers burned. But in that quiet room, the pain barely mattered. The cake was not just a prop. It was beautiful. A small smile touched her mouth, then disappeared when the door swung open. Celeste Quinn walked in wrapped in a cream wool coat. Pearls perfect. Perfume filling the room. "You are still here," she said. Harper explained that she was checking the structure, but her mother's cold eyes moved over the dirty bowls. Disgusted by the messy proof of honest work, Celeste looked at the cake last. For one foolish second. Harper hoped for warmth, but her mother only tilted her head. "It photographs well," she said. Harper swallowed her disappointment and explained how the light would catch the gold. Celeste interrupted, saying Vanessa wanted elegance, not drama. She studied a sugar peony without touching it, as if even admiration would give Harper too much. "It looks expensive," Celeste added, lips tightening. "Do not make tomorrow complicated." The threat came wrapped in a soft voice. Harper whispered that she would be fine, though both of them knew fine meant quiet, obedient, and out of the way. Celeste reminded her of the Whitmore family's expectations, of her father's political friends, of all the people who had to be impressed. "This is Vanessa's wedding," Harper whispered. Her mother nodded as if the lesson had finally landed. Harper looked at the cake and wanted to scream that she understood pressure better than anyone. She had canceled paid orders and walked to work in freezing rain just to afford the gold. Instead, she stayed quiet. Then Celeste mentioned the dress waiting at Harper's apartment and warned that no alterations were allowed. When Harper asked what dress she meant, Celeste's gaze turned icy. "You are not a bridesmaid." The sentence was soft, but it cut deep. Harper stared at her hands as Celeste lowered her voice into that careful tone she used whenever cruelty needed to sound like guidance. "Vanessa wants the photographs balanced," her mother said. In other words, Harper could be present enough to look like family, but not polished enough to be seen as one of them. Celeste touched her with 2 cold fingers, then left her alone in the freezing room. Harper looked back at the cake and realized how strange it was that sugar and wire could feel more tender than her own blood. She pressed her palms to the table and forced herself not to cry. Her apartment sat above an old tailor shop in East Boston. It was one narrow room with a slanted ceiling and a radiator that hissed like it resented her being there. The rent was below market because the building belonged to her father, a millionaire who still made sure she paid on time every month, and reminded her that his charity was more than she deserved. When Harper saw the cheap garment bag hanging from her doorknob, she froze. Part of her wanted to walk past it and leave the humiliation unopened. But her family was waiting in that bag, along with every polished expectation they had ever forced on her. The dress hung badly, dull and shapeless enough to make her disappear. A note was pinned to the front. "Wear this. Do not improvise. Do not embarrass me." Vanessa. Harper sat on the edge of her bed, surrounded by the quiet evidence of her life, the recipe notebooks, the cracked laptop, the face-down photo from the culinary school she could never afford to finish. She wanted to call Vanessa and refuse. She wanted to wear something that felt like herself. Then her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Please do not make tomorrow weird." Harper stared at the screen and remembered another night, years ago, when she had learned how little her love weighed in that house. She had been 14, staying up all night to bake Vanessa a birthday cake from scratch. Vanessa had laughed at it. Not viciously. Exactly, but with a careless pity that hurt worse. "Oh, Harper, that is sweet. But we already ordered one," she said, just as their father came in carrying an expensive bakery box. Harper's cake sat untouched on the counter until the frosting sagged and melted. The memory faded, but the ache stayed. Now she hung up the ugly silver dress and showered until her skin burned. She tried to sleep, but her mind kept counting the hours she had given to people who only remembered her when they needed something. By noon, she gave up on rest and carried 2 fresh pastry boxes into the rehearsal brunch. The hostess did not see a guest when she looked at Harper. She saw a delivery girl and pointed her toward the cold service entrance. Even after Harper explained she was with the Quinn party, she was sent down the dark service hallway. Inside, the dining room glittered with old money and expensive silk. Vanessa sat laughing with her future family, while the men stood around like portraits that had learned to breathe. When a bridesmaid praised the pastries, Vanessa quickly brushed it off as her sister's little creative hobby. Harper set the boxes down and smiled like it did not hurt. Her father, Preston Quinn, stood across the room, wearing the kind of smile bought with favors and real estate money. He only acknowledged Harper when the senator's wife asked about her. With a charming, empty grin, he reduced 27 years of work, debt, burns, and rented kitchens to 1 line. Harper was still finding her direction. To them, Vanessa was successful because she was marrying wealth. Harper was drifting because she built things with her hands. The senator's wife gave her a pitying smile and said creative souls needed time. Harper looked down at the crumbs and agreed, then spent the next 2 hours serving coffee like hired help. She spent the afternoon as the invisible assistant, fixing torn ribbons, carrying boxes, and finding safety pins for women who never learned her name. The worst moment came when the photographer asked her to step out of the frame so the immediate family could get a clean shot. Nobody stopped him. No one said she belonged there, driving home beneath a rainy sky. Harper felt their rejection pressing hard against her chest. Then her phone buzzed with a message from Roman Calder. He asked if she was still making beautiful things for people who did not deserve them. She pulled over, stared at the screen, and felt the old memory of him return. She had been working since dawn that day. Celeste had attended the gala as a guest, pretending not to know her own daughter except when she pulled Harper aside to criticize the dessert table. Broken and exhausted, Harper escaped to the dirty loading dock and cried in the dark. That was where Roman Calder found her. He was powerful, dangerous, dressed in a dark suit. The kind of man people whispered about when they mentioned shipping, construction, and favors no one wanted to explain. Yet when he saw her crying, he did not turn away. When she tried to apologize and move, he simply asked what she was running from. Roman asked who had made her cry. And even though Harper lied, he saw through it. When she admitted her own mother treated her like hired help, his face went cold. He knew that kind of pain. Under the dim light, he slipped her his card and promised real help. When she asked why a stranger would care, He said he knew what it looked like to drown where everyone could see you. It was a bitter comfort, realizing that a stranger could recognize her suffering more clearly than the family that claimed to love her. Harper kept the card but never called, now with rain striking her windshield. His text felt less like a coincidence and more like a door. Back in the Providence kitchen, the flawless wedding cake stood as a massive labor of love. Harper checked everything again: the temperature, the supports, the gold leaf packed with almost obsessive care. At 9 that night, Vanessa called, her voice sharp with cold impatience. Harper said she would drive the cake herself to keep it safe. Vanessa sighed and told her not to show up looking like delivery staff. She should use the side door so she would not ruin the photos. Then came the real blow. Vanessa ordered her not to tell anyone she had made the cake, because the groom's family expected elite vendors. Harper stood still, one hand pressed against the steel table. Vendor, the word hung in the quiet room. Clean and cruel. When Harper reminded Vanessa that she had begged her to make the cake, Vanessa scoffed. She said she was being generous, letting Harper feel included, and told her not to starve for attention on her big day. Before Harper could answer, Vanessa hung up. Harper sat in that kitchen until midnight, already dreading morning. At gray dawn, she packed the delicate tears into a rented van paid for with the last room on her credit card, driving toward Newport, watching the ocean smash against the stone walls of those enormous estates. She finally understood that she had spent years paying for a place they had never planned to give her. Harper ignored the impatient drivers honking behind her as she took the cliff road slowly, guarding the fragile cake with everything she had. Soon the Quinn estate rose above the Atlantic, a white stone fortress surrounded by gold chairs and silk tents. At the service entrance, the frantic wedding planner, Elise, met her with 2 assistants. But when Harper opened the van doors, Elise fell silent. Harper braced for criticism, but the planner was breathless. She whispered that the cake was extraordinary. The small validation almost made Harper cry. Then Vanessa's voice sliced through the moment, bright and brittle, as she appeared in a white bridal robe with fear hiding under her perfect smile. Vanessa stood there with perfectly styled hair and the exhausted confidence of someone terrified that one wrong detail might expose her. When Elise praised the cake and credited Harper, Vanessa's eyes flashed with panic before rage covered it. With a light, false laugh, she reduced Harper's work to logistics, saying her sister had merely helped coordinate things. Harper felt the air leave her lungs as Vanessa leaned closer and whispered, "Not today. Do not cause a scene." The warning was icy and familiar. Harper dragged her repair kit down the service hallway, carrying the ugly truth with her. Vanessa did not just want a perfect wedding. She wanted a perfect lie. In a quiet corner of that absurdly lavish wedding, the towering cake looked like art beneath the warm lights. Even the caterer stopped to take pictures, unaware of the exhaustion behind every tear. Harper stood beside it, fingers trembling as she adjusted the final sugar peony. Down the hall, Vanessa's practiced laughter echoed, and Harper retreated to a cold guest bathroom. The cheap silver dress her mother had chosen dug into her skin like a joke at her expense. In the mirror, she saw a ghost trying to fit into a world that had already pushed her out. Outside, 2 bridesmaids laughed and whispered through the door about how sad Vanessa's sister looked. Harper gripped the cold sink and waited for the whispers to fade. She refused to cry because tears left marks, and marks invited questions from Celeste. Her mother's words were always needles wrapped in velvet. Harper reapplied her lipstick and went downstairs. Celeste was already waiting, scanning her with sharp disapproval and muttering that the dress was tight in all the wrong places. Harper's face burned as she whispered that Celeste had chosen it. Her mother shrugged and said Vanessa had chosen it. She had only approved it. Then she told Harper to stay out of the photos because the light was unforgiving. A moment later, Preston walked in, his eyes sliding past Harper as if she were a misplaced chair. Preston checked his watch and reminded everyone that the groom's family was already at the church, then gave Harper a look that told her not to be late. She wanted to scream that she had been awake for 2 days, making sure this wedding was perfect. But she only nodded. The ceremony was held in an old stone church by the ocean. Harper slipped inside and realized there was no seat reserved for her. She hid behind a massive arrangement of white hydrangeas and was grateful for the darkness. When the organ swelled and Vanessa walked down the aisle on Preston's arm, he looked at her with a pride Harper had never received. Harper gripped the cold wooden pew and disappeared into the shadows. Harper did not want the designer dress, and she certainly did not want the groom. She had no hunger for a life measured in overpriced flowers and empty high society titles. She only wanted, just once, to walk into a room without feeling like an apology for existing. The vows ended, and she clapped with everyone else, her quiet applause swallowed by the crowd, as guests drifted toward the reception. She stayed behind on the stone steps and let the cold ocean wind hit her face. Her phone showed Roman S. name in an old, unread thread. No new message. Just his contact sitting there like a dangerous possibility. She locked the screen and returned to the estate. At the edge of the lawn, Harper looked at her work. For a brief second, she saw it the way the guests did a masterpiece. Then a woman in emerald silk stepped beside her and sighed over how divine it was, claiming Vanessa had flown it in from a Paris atelier. Harper watched the lie move through the party, dressed more elegantly than the truth ever had been. The woman went on about Vanessa's exquisite taste. The words "I made it" rose to Harper's lips and pressed against her teeth. But the woman was already looking past her for someone more important. Harper closed her mouth. Across the tent, Vanessa laughed while the ocean crashed below the cliffs. The band played on, and the magnificent cake stood there, with Harper's invisible fingerprints hidden beneath every petal. She lingered at the edge of the room, close enough to hear the praise, and far enough to remain what she had always been, present but not included. A waiter passed, and Harper took a glass of champagne just to give her shaking hands something to hold. She watched the bubbles rise in a restless line. Across the lawn, Vanessa moved like royalty with Grant's hand resting on her back. She accepted compliments for the flowers, the music, and the food as though beauty itself had arrived for her. Harper watched from the dark as her sister laughed beside the stolen masterpiece. Then came the final small cruelty. The groom's mother reached toward a sugar peony, and Vanessa caught her wrist, warning that it was delicate. Vanessa had no idea how delicate it really was. She had not spent sleepless nights shaping each petal, nor stood in a cramped kitchen with aching hands, begging the sugar to hold. But Vanessa knew how to claim what was not hers, and that had always been her talent. Celeste appeared and asked why Harper was hiding. Harper said she was just staying out of the way. Celeste sighed and said, "I was what people said when they wanted attention but were too proud to ask for it." Harper gripped her glass until her fingers hurt. The old apologies climbed up Harper's throat, but this time she forced them back down. For one brief second, Celeste looked almost concerned. Then the expression vanished. "Let your sister have her happiness," she whispered. Harper stared at Vanessa posing by the cake. "She has everything," Harper murmured. Celeste snapped that bitterness only made her look small. Harper met her mother's eyes and repeated, "I said she has everything." Celeste smiled with the coldness of polished marble and said some women grasped life while others waited for the world to bend to their feelings. Harper looked at the cake, then at her mother, and felt something inside her, loosen not break loosen. That night, the high society world glittered under golden light, but every shadow felt cold. As applause rolled through the tent, Celeste put on her perfect public smile and whispered for Harper to stand somewhere appropriate, then walked away. Harper remained frozen as Vanessa stepped up to speak, her beaded designer dress shining under the chandeliers. Vanessa thanked the crowd with trembling, theatrical grace that charmed everyone immediately. Harper stood with her shoulders tight, still waiting to hear her own name, even though she knew it was not coming. It was humiliating how hope could survive even after years of being starved. Vanessa turned toward the towering wedding cake. and the crowd followed her gaze with warm laughter. No one looked at Harper, the quiet sister who had poured herself into every layer. Instead, they applauded as Vanessa smoothly credited the cake to a fictional Parisian bakery. Then came the true twist of the knife. Vanessa tossed Harper a patronizing scrap of gratitude, thanking her only for running the errand and carrying the boxes. The polite chuckle that followed was small, but it shattered something. Harper stared at the woman in white and finally understood that Vanessa had not forgotten the truth. She had chosen to bury it in front of everyone. Harper's face went hot, then cold. Her glass trembled, spilling champagne over her fingers, while Vanessa locked eyes with her from across the tent. For one brief second, Vanessa's smile shifted into a private warning. Know your place. As the speeches dragged on, Harper slipped away toward the quiet mansion, desperate for one room that did not glow with belonging. But before she reached the side entrance, Preston's voice cut through the air. He stood there with his perfect silver hair, leaving his wealthy friends behind just long enough to corner her in the dark. Harper already knew that whatever came next would not be a conversation. A word with Preston. That was never a request. It was an order. Harper followed him into the dark, silent library. A room that seemed built for judgment rather than comfort, surrounded by tall wooden shelves. He handed her a plain white envelope and said the evening had made something clear. She pulled out the paper, her vision blurring as she read the formal eviction notice. 30 days to pack up and leave the small apartment she called home. When she tried to protest, Preston did not shout. He looked almost disappointed. That was worse. He said softness had failed her, so reality would have to finish the lesson. The quiet library became a courtroom, as Preston explained that her cheap rent had only ever been a temporary mercy. He said he hoped discomfort would push her toward a respectable future, not deeper into fantasy. Desperate to be seen. Harper brought up the wedding cake she had poured her life into, only to realize he already knew the truth. When she asked why he had allowed Vanessa to take the credit, his answer was simple and devastating. It was the story that protected the family. In his mind, he was not being cruel. He was preserving order. And to him, Harper's talent was only acceptable when it stayed useful, quiet and easy to explain. To her father, she was only the girl who mixed the frosting. He told her she had made something useful and warned her not to confuse utility with achievement. The word stayed in the air, sharp and humiliating. Useful, not talented. Not worthy. Just convenient. Looking at the eviction notice trembling in her hands, Harper understood why he had chosen this exact night. He believed pressure made people stronger because pressure had made him rich. But he did not understand the difference between shaping someone and crushing them. When he tried to dismiss her, something steady rose inside her, for the first time. She did not move. Her silence no longer belonged to him. There it was again. The language of her childhood, where affection sounded like a cold business agreement. Clutching the eviction notice, Harper whispered that she was leaving. Preston ordered her to return to the reception and behave. She stepped into the bright hallway and ran straight into her mother. One look at Celeste's eyes told her everything. She had known about the eviction. Celeste told her to stop making a scene and said her father had acted out of concern. The lie was smooth, practiced, and almost gentle. Harper looked at her mother and felt the last soft excuse she had been holding for her fall away. Celeste stepped closer, blocking the scene from the wealthy guests nearby. She reminded Harper that she was 27 now and could not keep drifting through life, hoping her little talent would save her from growing up. To Celeste, baking was only playing with sugar, and claiming credit for the cake would make Harper look desperate. Then she delivered the softer poison. Not everyone was meant to shine, and there was dignity in accepting a place in the background. Harper looked at her mother's manicured hand and remembered a lifetime of gentle control that left no room to breathe. This time, She pulled away. That is not dignity, she said quietly. That is disappearance. Celeste only blinked in shock as Harper escaped into the biting Newport night. She crossed the long, sloping lawn while the black ocean crashed against the cliffs, indifferent to her pain. In the freezing wind, her hands shook as she opened her phone and scrolled past every family name until she found Roman. He was dangerous. He was complicated. She knew that. But in that moment, he felt like the only person who had ever looked at her without needing her to shrink. She dialed. Hearing him say her name without disappointment or judgment almost broke her. She whispered an apology for calling. But his voice sharpened with immediate concern. Silence stretched across the line, broken only by the distant click of a car door closing. When Roman spoke again, his voice carried a quiet, dangerous weight. Are you hurt? Harper looked down at the crumpled eviction notice in her hand, a blade delivered by her own blood. I do not know, she whispered. Roman exhaled slowly, with frightening control. Stay exactly where I can find you, he said, and his tone left no room for doubt. After the call ended, she stood in the freezing dark and watched the glowing party tent, where her family celebrated without her. For 30 agonizing minutes she waited, until the music faltered as if the musicians had seen a ghost. The laughter died first, replaced by nervous whispers that moved faster than the ocean wind. 3 massive black SUVs rolled through the iron gates, slow and commanding. When Roman Calder stepped out, the night seemed to change shape around him. He wore a dark-tailored suit, open at the collar, no tie and no pretense. His sharp eyes moved over the wealthy crowd, and people parted without being asked. He ignored the wealth, the lights, the performance of it all, and walked straight toward Harper, where she stood frozen by the stone wall. He did not care about her stained dress or the crushed paper in her hand. He only studied her face. Who made you cry? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Harper tried to answer, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she handed him the eviction notice. He read it without expression, which made his quiet fury feel even more terrifying. Then he turned toward the glowing tent and found Preston Quinn with his eyes. Harper followed because the air felt too heavy to stand still. Preston approached with the polished grace of a man used to buying his way out of trouble. Mr. Calder, I do not believe we have been introduced, he said. Roman stopped. No, he replied, the single word cutting clean through the night. Celeste and Vanessa went still. Preston insisted it was a private family matter, but Roman refused to let him hide behind wealth and manners. If you humiliate her in public, we can keep the rest of your business public too, he said coldly. Vanessa pleaded with Harper to stop him, panic widening her eyes. Roman did not even look at Vanessa. He looked only at Harper, giving her the space to choose. Under the weight of 200 silent witnesses, Harper drew a steady breath. I made the cake, she said, and her voice cracked the silence. Every flower, every tear, every detail Vanessa just credited to Paris. There is no famous bakery. There is only me. The silence inside the wedding tent turned heavy enough to feel physical. Harper stood there facing Vanessa, naming the theft out loud. Vanessa tried to look wounded, but Harper gave a bitter, trembling laugh. When Preston barked at her to be quiet, she refused to lower her eyes. I tested the buttercream 6 times, she said. I stayed awake for 3 days in a rented kitchen because Vanessa demanded perfection. Then she told me to use the side door and pretend I was just an errand girl. Vanessa's fiancé looked on, his illusion finally cracking. Harper's voice broke, but she did not stop. I have spent my life being useful when needed and invisible when not. I am done. Preston's face turned a deep, angry red as he warned her that she was making a scene. Harper only smiled. Yes, she said. I am. Then she kicked off her expensive heels and let her bare feet touch the cold, honest dirt. With her shoes in one hand and the eviction notice in the other, she was ready to leave that gilded prison behind. when Preston tried to follow. Roman stepped in. He shifted his weight, blocking the path like a wall, and told him in a lethal whisper not to take another step. Preston sneered, but Roman did not move. As Harper walked away, the crowd parted in silence. This time, they saw her. Harper took one last look at the cake. It did not belong to them anymore. It was proof of what she could create when she was not being held down. Roman asked where she wanted to go. She said she wanted to go somewhere they could not make her feel small. When the car door closed, shutting out the shocked silence of her family, Roman gently took the eviction notice from her hands. Leaving did not feel clean or triumphant. It felt like grief. Harper watched the mansion shrink behind her, thinking of the girl who had once begged for a seat at that table. That girl had finally stood up and walked away, in the quiet car. Roman sat beside her as still as stone. He had folded the eviction notice and tucked it into his coat, as if hiding it could spare her from what it had already done. But pain does not work that way. A cheap piece of paper can cut deeper than steel when it carries the weight of family rejection. In the suffocating silence, Harper felt hollowed out. Her wedding shoes were still in the grass, left behind beside the girl she had been. She looked at her reflection in the dark window and whispered, "I ruined her wedding." The word sounded small, almost childish, but shame had always spoken to her in her family's voice. Roman watched her reflection. His quiet no cut through her shame. When she said he had just seen her make a mess of everything, his voice stayed steady. He had not seen a mess. He had seen a woman tell the truth in a place designed to punish her for it. She whispered that Vanessa was still her sister. Roman reminded her gently that sharing blood did not give someone permission to destroy her. Harper looked down at her grass-stained bare feet and realized she had nowhere left to go. "Tonight you come with me," he said. "Tomorrow, you decide what home means." He did not make it sound romantic. He made it sound safe. Boston rose ahead of them in silver and black glass. Roman's high-rise stood severe against the harbor, like a fortress built to keep out the judgment of the world. In the mirrored elevator, Harper clutched her shoes and looked like the sole survivor of a shipwreck. Roman stood beside her, calm and controlled, his power quiet rather than loud. The penthouse surprised her. There were no vulgar displays of wealth, no rooms screaming for attention, just simple wood floors, wide windows, and dark water beyond the glass. It should have intimidated her, but it did not. What frightened her more was the way Roman said nothing, giving her room to decide how much of his kindness she could bear. The penthouse was peaceful, warmed by a low fire, with a kitchen so clean it looked almost untouched. Harper stood frozen by the door and awkwardly offered to find a cheap hotel. Roman's steady gaze made it hard for her to avoid reality. She had 30 days to leave her apartment, an empty bank account, and a family she had just walked away from. She had almost nothing. Roman did not push. He only moved to the counter and asked when she had last eaten, as if he already knew her stomach had been tied in knots all day. As he began to cook, Harper realized that accepting kindness might be harder than enduring cruelty. Cruelty, at least, was familiar. "You do not have to eat it all," Roman murmured, keeping his eyes on the butter melting in the pan. Harper sank onto a wooden stool, hands resting on the cold marble counter, and watched him move with quiet precision. He toasted bread, poured hot tea, and set the simple meal in front of her without making a speech. The simplicity nearly undid her. After a wedding filled with expensive food that had offered her no comfort at all, plain toast became the first real warmth she had felt in days. Harper ate slowly, embarrassed by the tears filling her eyes. Roman turned away just enough to let her keep her dignity. Roman stared out at the dark harbor for a long moment before answering her quiet question about why he had come that night. He reminded her that he had promised to help, and unlike the people in her life, he meant what he said when she argued that he barely knew her. He spoke of the night He found her crying behind a loading dock because her mother had dismissed her like a servant. "You were erased," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers. "And I know exactly what that feels like." Harper suddenly wanted to know his secrets, to understand what had shaped him into a man people feared. But his silence warned her. There were rooms in him not even he liked entering. Midnight had passed, and Harper could feel her world cracking open at last. She whispered, "Thank you." Roman told her she never had to thank him for believing what he had seen with his own eyes. In the guest room, she slowly peeled off the heavy silver dress and let it fall to the floor like discarded armor. In the mirror, her face looked bare, shaken and entirely exposed. Her phone buzzed again and again with angry messages from the family she had offended. At last she turned it face down and chose quiet over conflict. She had spent years answering every accusation. Tonight, for the first time, she let the phone ring into nothing. When she woke, memories returned in sharp pieces: the microphone, the dark car, the crowd parting around her. Her phone lit up with 46 missed calls and a flood of demands for an apology. Old habits tugged at her mind, whispering that she should smooth things over, take the blame, and make everyone comfortable again. It was frightening how quickly the body remembered compliance. Then a soft knock broke the spell. Roman stood in the doorway in a simple black sweater, holding a warm cup of coffee. He reminded her, gently, that she had every right to leave those messages unread. Harper looked at the phone, then at the coffee, and chose the hand that offered her peace. Without his heavy suit jacket, Roman looked tired, like a man who had barely slept. Harper followed him to the kitchen, where warm pastries and fresh coffee waited. She noticed the silver wedding dress had been carefully hung in a protective bag instead of tossed aside like trash. The decency of that small gesture hit her harder than she expected. On the counter sat a thick manila folder containing a lease agreement for a beautiful brick storefront in Boston's historic North End. Staring at the papers, Harper felt her pulse jump. The dream was real enough to touch. That was what made it terrifying. Freedom had weight. Freedom came with bills, risks, and no one else to blame. Harper looked at the lease. 6 months paid in full. A complete commercial kitchen. Everything she had once been too afraid to imagine. Her heart began to race. "I cannot go from my father controlling my apartment to you controlling my business," she warned, already bracing for the trap. But Roman's eyes filled with quiet respect. "Good," he said. "If you had not thought of that, I would be worried." He did not demand gratitude. Instead, he set boundaries. The business would be in her name. There would be a real loan agreement. She would hire a lawyer who disliked him enough to keep him honest. Harper stared at him, unsettled by how badly she wanted to believe him. Roman did not present the folder like a rescue. He set it down as if it were simply an option. "I do not want your obedience," he said. "I want to see what you can build when nobody is standing on your hands." The words reached a place in Harper that still felt bruised. Suddenly she could picture sugar flowers, warm lights, and contracts bearing her own name. No family shadow. No borrowed permission. Just her. She admitted she was terrified. Instead of offering a polished speech, Roman only said, "I know." By noon, Mara Ellis arrived with sharp eyes, a leather planner, and no patience for fantasy. Roman introduced her as the attorney who had once threatened to sue him twice. Mara was a wake-up call in human form, with a handshake strong enough to crack glass. She told Harper she was brilliant but underprepared, which was workable. For once, hard questions about the future did not feel like weapons. They felt like tools. What did Harper want to sell? Did she know the price of butter? Could custom cakes become a real business? Harper began finding her voice, speaking of craft, flavor, and work that mattered. When Roman left, she released a long breath of relief. Mara noticed. "He frightens you," she said. "Good. He can open doors. But he cannot be the reason you walk through them. If you build this for him, You will fail. If you build this because you would bleed for it, Mara warned, then you may have a chance. Harper stared at her sad little napkin sketch. A window, a counter, and her name. I would, she whispered, and it sounded true. Later that day, quiet Nico drove her to the old apartment. Walking in, Harper saw the place for what it was, a monument to survival. Milk crates holding baking tools, a narrow bed, worn-out shoes by the door. Nico handed her a box and asked what mattered. She knew immediately. Her mixer, her notebooks, her recipes. Packing those pages felt like gathering pieces of herself. Then a loud knock shattered the moment. Nico stepped forward like a shield and opened the door only halfway. Celeste stood in the hall. Coat buttoned perfectly, face tight with anger and something that looked almost like fear. Nico remained polite and immovable. Miss Quinn is packing and does not want company, he said. Celeste demanded that Harper make him move. For a moment, 27 years of obedience roared inside Harper's head. Then Nico murmured, "You do not have to." Harper took a breath, looked her mother in the eye, and said she might be making a mistake. But at least it would be hers. Celeste accused Roman of poisoning her mind. Harper answered, "No, he believed me. There is a difference." Celeste stood speechless. Nico shut the door and locked the past outside. Harper stayed frozen until the footsteps faded. Then her knees gave out and she collapsed onto the bed. Nico simply picked up another box and murmured, "Not bad for the first time." Setting a boundary felt less like a crime and more like a muscle she had never used before. Together they loaded her 27 years into his car. It all fit into 4 boxes and 1 battered mixer. Looking up at her old window, Harper expected grief. But what came instead was space, air, the room to breathe. By evening, she was standing outside her dusty new shop, with Roman quiet beside her. Roman stayed silent as Harper peered through the filthy window. The space looked rough, almost hopeless. But in her mind she could already see display cases, warm lights, and a kitchen alive with sugar in motion. She saw cream-colored boxes stamped with Harper Quinn Atelier. "You like it," Roman said. Harper looked down at the dusty floor. "I am terrified," she admitted. He smiled. That was not the question. A real smile finally returned to her face. "Yes," she said. He handed her a small brass key. It was not a magical rescue. And she knew it. The place needed work. So did she. But for the first time, both belonged to her. Roman remained near the door, letting her take possession of the space. Harper ran her fingers along the cold steel counter and imagined the room alive with flour, sugar flowers, and the tired freedom of work that belonged to her. Then her phone buzzed with a cruel text from Vanessa, asking if Romanesque money made her think she was someone now. The old sting lasted only a second before fading. Harper turned the screen off. "Trouble?" Roman asked. She looked at the peeling paint and knew the answer. "No," she said. "Just noise." For 3 weeks. She muted the drama and learned the hard, unglamorous work of renovation. Permits, grease traps, electrical loads, none of it looked like a dream. But all of it had to be done. Harper spent mornings arguing with inspectors, afternoons comparing supplier quotes, and nights scrubbing dust from tiles that still looked dirty. The shop was colder than she expected and more expensive than she feared. Mara arrived with her leather planner and killed every romantic idea that could not survive a spreadsheet. When Harper showed her an $18 box for a $9 pastry, Mara stared at it for 3 seconds. "Beautiful," she said, bankrupt. Harper took the box back without arguing. So Harper learned quickly. She cut packaging costs, renegotiated flour prices, and called 20 offices with sample menus, while her hands still smelled of paint thinner. She practiced saying no without apologizing. When a rude delivery man tried to overrule Nico about the oven placement, Harper stepped between them and said the oven would go exactly where she marked it. Her voice shook. but she did not move. Nico's eyes warmed with quiet respect. Roman stayed in the background, sending contacts, security advice, and contractors only when she asked. Harper noticed the restraint cost him something. That mattered more than another grand gesture would have. She called through the open door. Most people close before midnight. Roman answered, his deep voice carrying through the empty shop. He stepped inside with a paper bag of warm, garlic-scented bread, and the dusty room suddenly smelled like comfort. "I brought dinner," he said. Harper tried to argue that she had already had coffee. He reminded her that coffee was not a meal. She rolled her eyes, but took the bag anyway. They ate on overturned paint buckets, surrounded by ladders, wires, and half-painted walls. For once, the silence between them did not ask anything from her. "You chose well," Roman said, looking around the room. Harper almost smiled, then remembered the call she had been avoiding. "My father called," she said. "He said I was being influenced." Roman's expression did not change, but the room did. "He also said my suppliers would start reconsidering if I kept embarrassing the family." The bread went cold in Harper's hand. She hated that Preston could still make her feel 12 years old with one polished threat. Roman did not tell her not to worry. He knew better. Instead, he asked, "What do you want to do?" The question startled her more than any advice would have. "He said I have no idea what kind of man you are." Harper told him. Roman looked directly at her. "Your father is not wrong." A heavy silence settled between them. "Then tell me," she said. His eyes darkened with a shadow older than pain. "I cannot tell you everything," he replied, "but I can tell you enough to decide whether you should run." Harper held her breath. "Should I? Yes," he said, "but you want tea." The honesty frightened her, but she could not look away. Roman looked toward the unfinished kitchen and admitted that he had built his name in brutal rooms where mercy was treated as weakness. Harper listened in the quiet. Roman did not try to make himself sound misunderstood. "I will not insult us both by lying," he said, when she asked if he was dangerous to her. He said no. Then he added, "I am dangerous near you. Can you let me decide when I need protection?" she asked. His jaw tightened, and he promised only to try. "That is not a yes," she whispered. "No," he said. "It is the truth." A week later, Harper hired Tess, a 22-year-old with a sharp tongue and hidden tattoos. Tess had worked in cafes and at a grocery bakery she called the Graveyard of Pastries. Harper liked her immediately, because Tess did not pretend to be softer than she was. By week 5, the shop finally looked less like a construction site and more like a place someone might remember. Soft cream walls, dark wood shelves, warm brass lights, nothing flashy. Nothing borrowed from Vanessa's world. Harper tested lemon rosemary tarts until Tess begged for mercy. She remade sugar flowers until her fingers cramped. Nico kept pretending not to eat the almond cookies, cooling near the back door. Roman tasted everything with the seriousness of a judge and pointed to the cherry almond cake. "That one," he said. Harper took a bite, hated that he was right, and wrote it on the opening menu. Then came the rainy Saturday morning of the soft opening. Harper expected maybe 20 people. By 8:30, a line stretched past the window. Her hands shook so hard Tess had to nudge her gently toward the lock. Across the street, Roman stood under a black umbrella with Nico, both of them damp from the rain. He did not come inside. He did not take over. He simply watched through the glass and let the moment belong to her. Harper unlocked the door. The bell chimed. Someone asked for 6 tarts. Someone else wanted the cherry almond cake. And suddenly Harper had no time left to be afraid. Tess moved behind the counter as if she had been born there. A stranger in a navy raincoat bought a lemon rosemary tart, took one bite, and said it tasted like spring after a terrible winter. By 1 in the afternoon, every shelf was empty. Harper stood staring at the bare wood, flour on her cheek and tears in her eyes. Outside, Roman still watched through the glass. He did not clap or draw attention. He only placed one hand over his heart. It was small, almost private, and somehow steadier than applause. Harper wiped her face, turned back to the kitchen, and started mixing more dough. Roman's silent gesture stayed with her, full of things neither of them had said. 2 days later, a major review appeared, calling her baking a triumph that turned sugar into architecture. Harper read it 3 times, letting the validation settle in. Then the first cancellation arrived. A corporate client apologized, saying they had received concerning information about Harper's reliability. 10 minutes later, a supplier suddenly demanded full payment up front. Harper knew the pattern before her phone rang. Preston, her father. The smile vanished. She let it ring twice. On the 3rd call, she answered and stepped away from the bright bakery into the shadowed kitchen. Preston's words were pure ice, but he still wore the voice of a man offering guidance. He said powerful men did not invest in women like her without demanding a price, then added that he was trying to spare her from public ruin. Women like her. The phrase was meant to make her small, but Harper had no room left inside her for his cruelty disguised as wisdom. She looked toward Tess humming off-key in the next room, and told her father she knew exactly what being used felt like. When he said she was embarrassing the family, Harper answered quietly that she was finally living without his permission. Preston paused, then said new businesses were fragile things, with men like Preston. Threats and warnings often wore the same expensive suit. Before hanging up, Harper told him she was no longer as alone as he had trained her to be. Her hand shook, but not from regret. 3 nights later, darkness answered back. She arrived to find the front window shattered, cold wind blowing through the broken mouth of her dream. On the floor lay a brick wrapped in black string, surrounded by glass shards and ruined sugar petals that looked like scattered teeth. The attached note called her, ashamed her family. Hot, blinding rage took over. When Tess arrived 10 minutes later, she stared at the wreckage and whispered, "Tell me we are not closing." Tess stepped forward, glass crunching under her shoes, but Harper told her to stay back. That was when she noticed the blood. A thin red line ran across her palm where the note had sliced her. She had not even called Roman. But he arrived before the police finished taking photos. The second he stepped through the shattered doorway, the room went silent, his eyes fixed on her bandaged hand, and a dark, dangerous quiet settled over him. Harper tried to calm him, saying the police and insurance would handle it. Roman was not listening. Not completely. He turned to Nico and gave one simple command. Find out who touched her shop. The words fell like a blade. But Harper stood her ground. No, she whispered, firm enough to freeze the air. Roman was furious. Someone had damaged her shop, threatened her, and cut her hand. And his every instinct wanted destruction. His cold rage frightened her, but she met his eyes. She knew what he wanted. A name, a locked room, and enough violence to make sure it never happened again. Her voice shook, but she did not step back. She told him she was not territory to be defended with blood. She knew he cared. But she would not let her dream become another thing men fought over in the dark. Even the police officer felt the tension in the room. Roman stepped closer, his voice low. He reminded Harper that she had wanted to choose when she needed protection, then admitted he was trying to respect that, even if he was failing badly. Harper's chest tightened, but she looked at him and said, "Try harder." It was a fragile moment between 2 people shaped by damage. Finally, Roman backed down. He told Nico to get security footage. Talk to no one, and touch no one. By morning, plywood covered the broken window, and Tess stood outside with black paint, writing 3 words. Still here. Still baking. By noon, half the neighborhood had taken pictures of it. Their defiance had spread. Reporters gathered, and Harper spoke with raw, unbought honesty. When they asked if her family had done this, she refused to say her father's name. She only said some people became uncomfortable when women refused to stay in the boxes built for them. Later, Roman appeared in the quiet kitchen. He had found the man responsible, a security worker paid through one of Preston's companies. Harper turned off the water and closed her eyes. The truth settled into her bones with a cold heaviness. A fragile part of her had still hoped her father had a line he would not cross. Now she knew better. When Harper asked what Roman had done, he hesitated 1 second too long. Then he told her the truth. Nothing violent. He had given the proof to a journalist before asking her. Harper stared at him, stunned and angry. He had chosen a cleaner weapon, but he had still chosen for her. Roman stepped closer and admitted that he had spent his life protecting what was his. Harper warned him, quietly but firmly, that she was not property and not a battlefield. The air grew heavy with vulnerability as Roman offered the rawest truth he had. He did not know how to care for someone without preparing for war. Harper did not forgive him immediately. That mattered too. This powerful man in a tailored suit looked as if he were bracing for a blow that would never come. When Harper asked who had taught him to be that way, his eyes drifted toward the window. His father, he said, had run their home like a prison made of rules and silence. His mother had learned never to ask for gentleness, and Roman had learned never to need it. By 15, he had become the thing people feared. Harper stepped closer and whispered that she did not need him to control the room. She needed him to stand in it with her, even when standing still felt impossible. His dark eyes softened, and for once, he had no answer ready. Romanesque silence moved through Harper more deeply than any command could have. He reached out and took her wrist, his fingers surprisingly gentle as his thumb wiped away a smear of flour. The gesture held none of the violence attached to his name, yet she felt it everywhere. When he tried to pull back, she caught his hand. He froze. Harper rose onto her toes and kissed him. For one long breath, he stayed still. Then his hand moved her cheek, slow enough to give her every chance to pull away. She did not. The kiss deepened, full of coffee, restraint, and the quiet darkness they both knew too well. When they parted, neither of them pretended it was simple. Harper had spent her life being shaped into whatever others needed. Now a dangerous man stood in her kitchen, and with one word stay she invited in the kind of chaos she had always been told to fear. The next morning, the article came out. Preston was not named, but everyone connected the dots. He went silent, while Harper's phone exploded. Ironically, the scandal brought customers. People came to the bakery for gossip, then stayed because the food was extraordinary. By afternoon, the display case was empty. Just when Harper thought she had survived the worst of it, the bell over the door chimed. Vanessa walked in wearing a luxury camel coat and a face too tired to look cruel. Beneath Vanessa's expensive armor, exhaustion showed in her eyes. "So this is it," she said, looking around the small shop. Harper wiped her hands on a towel. "This is it." Vanessa sneered that it was smaller than she expected. Harper answered, "It is bigger than where I started." Vanessa snapped that Harper had ruined everything and turned the wedding into a public trial. "It felt like one," Harper said softly. Vanessa said she should have handled it privately. Harper met her eyes and said, "I tried privately my whole life." That was when something in Vanessa cracked. She looked away, suddenly less untouchable than she wanted to seem. Then the cold mask slid back into place. "You think applause means they care about you," Vanessa said. But Harper did not flinch. She folded the towel and replied, "No, I think applause means they finally saw the work." Vanessa asked what would happen when people stopped looking. Harper's answer came steady. "Then I keep working." That was when the truth slipped out. Vanessa whispered, "I needed that wedding to be perfect." Harper looked at her and said, "No, you needed everyone to believe you were perfect." Vanessa's mouth tightened, but tears brightened her eyes before she turned away. For 1 second, Harper saw not a villain, but a woman terrified of being ordinary. Yes, Harper said, when Vanessa told her she had changed. This time, she owned it. Vanessa left without buying anything. Harper watched through the window as her sister paused on the cold sidewalk and looked back once not at Harper, but at the bakery sign before vanishing into the night. Later in the darkened shop, Harper sat alone with a cold cup of tea. Her laptop chimed. An email from a national bridal magazine appeared on the screen, asking to feature her atelier. They wanted to interview her about her artistry, her authorship, and the cake that had started a quiet revolution. Beneath the makeshift sign that read "Still Here, Still Baking," Harper felt the rough table under her palms. Her first draft was too polite, too careful. She deleted it. The second sounded like a cold business contract, so she saved that tone for Mara. The third version came slowly, shaped by the strength she had earned. She wrote that she would do the feature, but only if the focus stayed on her labor and her artistry. No family drama, no cheap gossip. Her name mattered. For years, Harper had been trained to be agreeable before she was honest, hiding pain beneath a polite smile so other people could remain comfortable. She was tired of turning every sharp truth into something soft enough for others to swallow. She clicked send. The sky did not fall. No one came through the door to punish her for being honest. In fact, the small digital chime felt almost sacred. The next morning, Mara read the email over coffee and nodded. Good, she said. Harper waited for the catch. But Mara only smirked and said she was practicing restraint. Tess leaned over the counter and joked that it sounded classy and terrifying, which was completely on brand. By noon, the magazine agreed to every term. No drama, no fake tears. The article would focus on Harper's work and on how often women's labor was hidden behind prettier names. Harper read the reply twice before letting herself smile. Then the old panic crept back in. Being ignored had been painful, but at least it had been familiar. Being seen meant she could be judged, rejected, or misunderstood in new ways. Harper could already imagine Celeste tossing the magazine aside and calling her dramatic. Later, Roman found her staring at sugar petals. "You are thinking too loudly," he said. Harper snapped back. "That sounds like something a man says when he has no idea what I am thinking." Roman stepped closer, his coat damp from the rain. "You are wondering if the attention is a trap." He was right, and she hated that he was right. In the vanilla-scented kitchen, he looked too large and too steady. But the room did not feel smaller with him in it. Harper carefully set down a delicate sugar petal. "I wanted them to notice my work," she admitted. "Now they are. And it feels like I am standing in front of a speeding train." Roman looked at her across the table. "Then do not stand on the tracks." It was annoyingly simple advice, which made it even more annoying. He glanced around at the flour-dusted counters, the messy boxes, and all the quiet evidence of her passion. "This is not danger," he said softly. "This is living. You are just not used to it." When she told him she had named the cake the Unhidden, pride flickered across his face. He did not drown her in praise. He simply said, "Show me." The cake looked nothing like the one her sister had stolen. It was tall and strong, not fragile. Clean ivory buttercream covered each tier, while sugar peonies climbed upward, opening wider with every level. Fine gold threads traced the sugar like light breaking through cracks in stone, ending in one unfinished blossom. On a gray Thursday morning, the magazine crew arrived with heavy equipment and loud voices. Tess pretended to be bored. Mara stood guard, and Nico watched the street. Roman stayed outside in his car across the road. He did not crowd her or step into the spotlight. He waited to be invited in. Harper saw him through the window and understood the effort behind that restraint. The photographer lowered her camera and stared at the sugar blooms. "Who taught you this?" she asked. Harper touched the edge of the table. "No one," she said. "I taught myself because real flowers die. but sugar can outlast the rooms that underestimated them. During the interview, they spoke about technique, discipline, and the weight of putting her own name on the door. When asked whether the Newport wedding had started her career, Harper looked toward Romina's car and shook her head. "No," she said. "It was the last time I let someone else write my story." The camera clicked at that exact moment. 2 weeks later, the photo ran. Harper in a cream apron beside her masterpiece. Harper did not wear a polite smile meant to make strangers comfortable. She looked straight into the lens. Fierce and real. The headline read, "Harper Quinn builds cakes that refuse to disappear." The bakery flooded with orders almost overnight. Planners emailed. Brides called. And a high-end Manhattan hotel begged for a tasting. Young culinary students stood outside and looked at her sign as if it gave them permission to dream. Preston stayed silent, but Celeste kept calling. When Harper ignored her, Celeste arrived in person on a quiet Tuesday morning. The bell chimed, and Harper looked up to see her mother in a pale blue coat, flawless as ever. In an instant, Harper felt 10 years old again. Tess walked out with a tray, saw Celeste, and froze. "Want me to stay?" she whispered. Harper shook her head. Tess hesitated, then retreated to the kitchen, close enough to listen. Celeste looked around the room. "It is lovely," she said. "Thank you," Harper replied, her voice cooling over. Celeste approached the counter with her gloved hands gripping her purse like a shield. "I read the article. It was very well written." Harper closed the display case. "Did you come here to review the journalism?" Celeste's mouth tightened. There she was, the mother who knew how to discuss manners more easily than pain. "No," she admitted. "Your father is under pressure. People are unkind." "To him?" Harper asked. Celeste's eyes flared. "To all of us," she corrected, trying to save what dignity she could. Harper let out a dry, hollow laugh, and Celeste flinched. "You think this is funny?" she asked. "No," Harper said. "Just familiar. When my heart was breaking, you called it inconvenient. Now that he is embarrassed, you call it unkind." The quiet hum of the bakery returned, making the silence feel even heavier. Celeste whispered that she had only been trying to prepare Harper for a harsh world. Harper stepped closer. "You did not teach me to survive the world. You taught me to survive this family." Harper crossed her arms and let the silence stretch. "I do not know how to be what you want me to be," Celeste whispered, suddenly looking small. The child inside Harper wanted to run to her, but the woman she had fought to become stayed still. "I do not need you to be what I want," Harper replied. "I need you to tell the truth." At last, Celeste admitted she had let them shrink Harper because facing it would have meant facing her own failures. It did not erase the years of pain, but at least it was real. "I hear you," Harper said, offering no easy forgiveness. Celeste walked out, the bell chiming behind her. Harper let herself breathe only after the door closed. Tess peeked out from the kitchen doorway, breaking the heaviness. "You okay?" Harper nodded slowly. Tess lifted a tray with a warm pastry. "I saved you the ugly croissant. The one that looks emotionally complicated." Harper laughed, and for the first time in years, the sound came free. 3 days later, just after closing, Vanessa appeared. No designer sunglasses, no dramatic coat, just plain jeans and a tired, makeup-free face. When the bell chimed, Harper looked up from wiping tables. "We are closed," she said softly. Vanessa stepped forward and placed Harper's worn business card on the counter. The card's edge was bent, worn from being handled. "I kept it," Vanessa confessed. When Harper asked why, the polished mask finally broke. "At first, to hate it. Then because I did not know what to do with the fact that you did not fail." Vanessa admitted she had waited for Harper to crawl back, had hoped the shop would close, so Harper would understand she needed them. I did need you, Harper whispered. Vanessa looked away. You needed a sister. I just liked having someone below me. The truth was ugly and raw. Vanessa had stolen Harper's cake design because she wanted the beauty without admitting where it came from. She had wanted admiration so badly that she treated Harper's talent like a threat. Late that night, in the quiet corner of the bakery, two sisters sat with the ruins of what they had been. Under the table, Harper dug her nails into her palm to steady herself. Across from her, Vanessa wept and admitted the bitter jealousy she had carried for Harper's honest life. Vanessa had lived in a hall of mirrors for so long that she feared if people stopped looking at her, she would disappear. Harper felt the weight of every betrayal between them and said quietly that she could not forgive her yet. Vanessa did not argue. She only nodded. Harper stood, placed 2 pastries in a box, and tied it with a black ribbon. It was not forgiveness. It was proof that the door was not locked forever. Harper held out the box, and Vanessa accepted it as if it were made of glass. This is not forgiveness, Harper warned softly. Vanessa nodded and asked what was inside. Harper pointed to the receipt on the table. It was a bill. Vanessa let out a wet, genuine laugh. A small echo of the sisters they had been before life became so sharp. After Vanessa left, Harper stepped into the cool night air. Roman waited under the street lamp with his hands in his pockets. He had stayed outside, respecting her boundary, choosing to stand beside her instead of in front of her. Harper walked toward him slowly, feeling tired, sad and strangely lighter. Over the next few months, the broken front window was replaced with clean glass, and the shop hummed with real life. Harper's hands were always tired, but her heart felt full in a way she had never known. One evening, a young bride sat across from her, twisting her ring nervously. She whispered that her wedding cake did not need to be special, because she did not want to be a burden. Harper recognized that small, defeated voice immediately. She had lived in that same quiet prison for years. Sliding her pencil across the table, Harper said, "Tell me what you actually want." Later, when she locked up, Roman waited by the curb. No grand gesture, just a steady presence in the cold. "You are late," Roman murmured as she stepped outside. "And yet, here you are, still waiting," Harper replied, moving closer as the street lamp caught the silver in his dark hair. He had waited in the cold to give her the space to finish her work. With a soft smile, she told him about her new commission for 400 guests at the Boston Harbor Hotel. Roman looked at her, his expression softening completely. "There she is," he whispered, seeing the woman who finally knew she was allowed to take up space. The old doubts no longer had the same bite. Harper touched his coat and quietly told him she loved him. Roman went completely still, the city fading around them. "Harper," he whispered, "I am not hesitating because I do not feel the same." When he said those words, he needed her to understand what kind of man was saying them. Harper held his gaze and told him she already did. He touched her cheek gently. He had loved her before she believed she was worth defending. And she had loved him once. He learned she was strong enough to protect herself. He kissed her under the street lamp, holding her like someone chosen, never claimed. A year later, Harper delivered a spectacular 5-tier cake of gold and ivory to a grand ballroom on the harbor. It was not a copy of her old work. It was stronger, brighter, fully hers. Cake artist Harper Quinn, the coordinator read, and the words hung in the air, clean and undisputed. During the reception, the bride took the microphone and thanked Harper first, praising her for creating the exact cake she had dreamed of, but could never describe. As the room broke into applause, Harper stepped out from the shadows of the service entrance and allowed herself to be seen. Across the crowded ballroom, Roman caught her eye and raised his glass with a quiet, knowing smile. This time, she did not look away. later on the breezy harbor terrace beneath the midnight sky. Roman joined her without a word. Harper listened to the applause fade behind the glass and realized she no longer needed it to prove she existed. Roman asked if she still wanted to disappear. Harper looked back at the ballroom. At guests eating cake with her name printed on the menu. At staff moving around a masterpiece no one could steal from her. No, she said. The answer was simple, but it had been hard-earned. In time, the Quinn name began to change. It no longer meant her father's damaged empire or her sister's wedding scandal. In the North End, on a cream-colored box tied with a black ribbon, Quinn meant almond, cherry and sugar flowers that looked alive. One rainy morning, Harper noticed a young girl standing outside the bakery window, staring in with the same hungry, careful hope Harper remembered from herself. Harper opened the door before the girl could run. "Are you here for coffee?" she asked. The girl shook her head and whispered that she wanted to learn how to make flowers that lasted. Behind Harper, Tess was already piping buttercream at 5:30 in the morning, and outside, Roman's car pulled to the curb with coffee waiting. Harper looked back at the warm ovens, the full counters, the name on the glass, and then at the girl still hovering on the threshold. She smiled and stepped aside. "Then come in," she said. The bell chimed above them, soft and clear. Harper Quinn had not only claimed her own light, she had learned how to leave the door open.